This Advent season, we've been taking a look at Jesus' favorite book in the Bible. And we've come to discover that it was the book of the prophet Isaiah that Jesus really felt deeply connected to. And most of the times when he was teaching his disciples, he would go to that book and share the wisdom of that time of God's history among us. And it challenged all of us, I think, when we first began to think about what our own favorite books are in life. And so I've struggled over these last few weeks to kind of think about what books I love, what books have sort of shaped me. And I'm getting there. I have a collection, I guess I would say. I love books about sharks. And those are only maybe just slightly ahead of books about dinosaurs. I love books, of course, about faith and wisdom, history. Those are up there on some of my favorite book lists. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Harry Potter as one of my favorite stories to enjoy. I think what I love about all of these different books and why it's so very hard for me to choose one as a favorite is because they teach me something about who I am. And they teach me different things about the world and wisdom, hope and awe and the power of nature and of the history of our world. Where our world has been and where it is going. Isaiah, he lived in a time of great consequence in the history of the children of Israel. He lived towards the second portion of the kingdom period. And he spoke to the leaders, both religious and political, of that time. He spoke to them about the importance of remaining faithful to God and not to strive to do things on their own. But of course, as you see, is so often the case, even among many of our own countrymen today and people around the world, there's something in us that says to us, well, maybe I can do things alone. Maybe I don't need the guidance of others. Maybe I don't need the guidance of God in my life. We kind of fool ourselves into thinking that, and that's exactly what Isaiah was talking about in his book so many, many years ago. And that kind of hubris that the leaders of the time had is so very much still part of the world today. Israel begins to meddle, so to speak, in the politics of the world at that time with the great empires. And of course, Israel was prime real estate for a lot of those nations and empires, wasn't it? It sort of was at a crossing point between the great civilizations of the Fertile Crescent and, of course, the great granary that was Egypt and North Africa. And then, of course, with all of the classical wonderful goods and things that came from the Mediterranean Sea. All of this surrounded this place called Israel. And so, of course, it makes sense that the great empires of Assyria and Babylon and Egypt would long to control that area, as the Romans would years later on. But you see, there was a major difference in these empires and the way in which God viewed them and the way that he viewed his holy people. You see, the leaders of those empires cared very, very little for maybe even their own people, but they certainly did not love the children of Israel in the same way that God loved them. And of course, this is the warning that Isaiah gives to the leaders of Israel. He warns them to stay away from these people, that they are different from him and from what God's plan is for the world. That the Assyrians, a place that the Bible calls a land bathed in blood, would turn and destroy Israel. And that the Babylonians, of course, what did they want from Israel? Well, they wanted to sort of use them as a way to weaken their neighbor, Assyria. And Egypt, in the same way, wished to do the same. And of course, as history goes on, we know that Isaiah's warning comes to pass. And Babylon will lead the children of Israel into what is known as the Babylonian captivity. That they will bring low Jerusalem and turn it, as we hear in Isaiah today, into like a desert land, void of all that is beautiful, void of all that was wonderful. But if Isaiah's prophecy is not just doom and gloom, is it? It's certainly a warning, an unfortunate warning that comes true. But Isaiah's message is that even in this time of suffering, that there is hope for a new life to emerge from it. That this painting of suffering that Isaiah gives to the children of Israel is not one that is to completely be despaired of, but that from the ruins of Israel will come a new beginning of holiness, a new life with God. He says this, he says, "Say to those whose hearts are frightened, be strong and fear not. Here is your God. He comes with vindication, and with divine recompense, he comes to save you." That is the beautiful message, isn't it, of Isaiah's scripture today. That even in the most darkest of times, that God remembers his children, and that he loves them all the same, and that his faithfulness to us will never go away. And this desert land, seemingly deserted of humanity, will one day again come to bear fruit. And the love of God will be felt once more. And isn't this the exact message that Jesus brings to the world? That even in his destruction, his death upon a cross, that he will remember his people, that he will remember us, and that out of the destruction of his own body, he will rise again to newness of life and bring with him a new beginning of holiness in the world. So that you and I, when we face those dark times ourselves, that we will not be alone and we will not despair. Because into that darkness, when we invite Christ, he travels with us so that we do not fall or stumble in the darkness, but see our way to better days with him. You know, I think at times we all think that we can live this life alone. We know better than others. We become arrogant. We refuse the help of those who love us. We may even refuse to acknowledge God. We may refuse to seek his guidance. But in the book of the prophet Isaiah, we hear God's vision of hope and his message to us, which is of love and fidelity. That no matter how far you or me or any of us have traveled from his presence, that God is faithful to his people and is faithful to his promise, and that we will be remembered by him. And that all we have to do to return to his love and grace is to be willing to accept him. And so maybe this Advent season, you yourself have struggled in your faith. Or maybe you know someone who is struggling in faith in this life. Remind them of what Isaiah says. Remind them of God's fidelity, that no matter how far they may have traveled from him in this world, that God remembers them and loves them and wishes to be with them once again.